Greetings guys, my name is Jotman and today I'm going to be trying a new type of video. It's going to be a breakdown of a Bible through the books and the chapters. So we're going to start right at the beginning in the book of Genesis. Now in the book of Genesis, verse 1, it talks about how God created the heavens and the earth. And it goes on in verse 2 to talk about how the earth was without form and void. In verses 3 and 4, God created light and separated it from darkness, and that was the first day. In verses 6 through 8, God created firmament, which is basically the heavens and the sky, and that was the second day. And on the second day, this was the only day that God didn't say, and it was good. And on the third day, God created dry land. He called it earth and brought forth plants. That was verses 9 through 13. Verses 14 through 19, God created the sun, the stars, and the moon. That was the fourth day. On the fifth day, God created winged fowl, whales, creatures that lived in the water. On the sixth day, verses 24 through 31, God created animals and creatures that are on land. He also created man, both male and female, and gave them dominion over the creatures. Now, a few verses that I found important in Genesis 1 was that God saw that it was good. He repeats this 6 times, and even a 7th time on verse 28, he says, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that maketh movement on the earth." So that was him giving them dominion over all the animals. And what the interesting part is, in Genesis 31, it says, "And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day." So on the 6th day, he saw that all his creation together was very good, and I found that kind of cool. In Genesis 2, it said that God rested and sanctified the 7th day. That was verses 1 through 4. Verses 5 and 6 talked about how there was no rain and no men to till the ground, and water literally came up on the ground like a mist to water the plants. In verses 7 and 8, God created man from dust, and he gave him life and put him in the garden. In verses 9 through 14, the author is describing the garden to us. In verses 15 through 17, God tells Adam he can eat from anywhere except the tree of good and evil. Verses 18, God decided that Adam should not be alone. Verses 19 through 20, Adam names all the animals that were created. In verses 21 through 25, God puts Adam to sleep and then takes one of his ribs and creates woman. Now, a few verses that stuck out to me in Genesis 2 were Genesis 2:2, and it says, "And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all of his work which he had made." So in other words, God has taken a rest on the 7th day. Does God need to take a rest on the 7th day? Probably not, but it's setting an example for us. On verses 2:24, it says, "Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." And I found this verse very important in terms of marriage, because in marriage you do leave your mother and father, and you join with a woman, and you do become one. All right, and in Genesis 3, verses 1 through 6, a snake or serpent was tempting the woman. Now I say woman and not Eve at this point, because we don't know that this is Eve yet. We haven't gotten to her name. So it tempts the woman, and the woman eats the fruit. And the woman then tempts her husband, which is Adam, and Adam takes a bite of the fruit. In verse 7, they now realized they were naked, so they made aprons from fig leaves. In verse 8, they attempted to hide from God, which obviously didn't work. In verses 9 through 13, Adam and the woman talked to God about what they did. Verse 14, God cursed the serpent. Verse 15 through 19, God cursed Adam and the woman. And in verse 20, we get a first look at Eve's name, which means the mother of all living. So Eve is going to go forth and obviously give birth to the human nation. And then in verse 21, God made clothes for Adam and Eve. In verse 22 through 24, they were cast out from the garden, and a flaming sword was put on there that protects the garden from every direction. In Genesis 4, verse 1, Eve bears Cain, which is a tiller of the ground. And verse 2, Eve bears Abel, which is the keeper of the sheep. And Cain and Abel, in verses 3 to 5, bring offerings to God. And God respects Abel's offering, but does not respect Cain. Cain is obviously upset about this. In verse 6 and 7, God warns Cain. However, Cain does not listen, and in verse 8, he slays Abel. Verses 9 through 16, God banishes Cain because he's slain Abel, and Cain complains, feeling that he will be persecuted and killed. So God puts a mark on Cain's head and prevents anybody from killing him, or they'll get his wrath. In verse 17, Cain bears a son, Enoch, and builds a city and names it after that same son. In verses 18 through 24, we get a glimpse at Cain's family tree. And then at verse 25, we come back to Adam, and it shows that Adam had a new offspring named Seth, and Seth had Enos. In Genesis 5, of verses 1 through 32, you get a look at Adam's family tree all the way through Noah. In Genesis 6, it talks about the multiplication of Genesis 6, verses 1 through 2, it talks about the multiplication of men. And 3, it interesting sets the limits to about 120 years old. So you look at these days and you don't see people really live to be 120, and I think it goes back to that limit. Verse 4 talks about the giants that are on the earth and how they were like kind of heroes and people of power of old. And then verse 5 and 6, we start to get a glimpse into how bad this world is really becoming, because it saws that God saw the wickedness and he actually grieved. Now, in verse 7, because of this wickedness, God vowed to destroy man, beast, and fowl of the air. In verse 8 through 10, however, he finds Noah's. And Noah has God's grace because he is one of the only person, him and his 3 sons, that is actually walking with God and doing right. 11 through 12 talks about how the earth is corrupted. And 13 through 16, God gives Noah instructions to build the ark, which is kind of ironic because after God gives Noah the instructions to build the ark, he then tells Noah about the flood that he's going to bring. Verses 18 through 22, God commands Noah to gather the animals. So we have the animals being gathered for the ark. And then we get to an important verse in there I found was 6:6, which was... my Bible app stopped loading. And if repented, the Lord had made man earth and grieved in his heart. So he is obviously very upset about what this earth is coming to. Then we move on to Genesis 7. In Genesis 7, he talks about how many animals are needed for the ark, and God tells Noah his plan in verse 4 about 40 days and 40 nights of rain. In verses 5 through 10, it describes the 7 days before the flood. In verses 11 through 24, it describes the flood and the rain. So important verses I found here were verses 7, 2, and 3. So, of every clean beast thou shalt take thee by 7s, the male and his female of the beast are not clean by 2, the male and his female. And of fowls also of the air by 7s, a male and a female, to keep seed alive upon the face of the earth. Now everybody thinks the ark animals were 2 by 2, and this was not the case because it was only 2 by 2 by the unclean animals. The clean animals and the birds were actually 7 by 7, so 7 males and 7 females. Another verse I found was Genesis 7:24. And the waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. That means for 150 days, the earth was completely flooded. And then we go into Genesis chapter 8, and it says, verse 1 through 6, the flood waters start to recede. So the waters are starting to recede. And in 7 and 9, Noah sent out a raven and a dove to see what the waters had receded enough. Now the dove came back with nothing, but the raven never returned. So again he tried. In verses 10 and 12, he sends out the dove again, and the dove brings back an olive, so he knows it's kind of okay. He waits 7 days and sends out the dove one last time, and the dove doesn't return. So verses 13 through 14, Noah exits the ark, and he finally finds dry land. 15 through 19, God commands Noah and everything else on the ark to be fruitful and multiply and exit the ark. Now this verse is becoming very, very prevalent at this point, the be fruitful and multiply, and I'll touch on this in a second. And then Noah builds an altar to God and burns an offering to him. Now the burnt offering he sent was one of every clean beast he had. And then God is pleased with the offering and promises not to curse the ground because of man again, because man's wickedness is in his heart. Some important takeaway verses for Genesis chapter 8 is 8:17, which says, "Bring forth thee every living thing that is of flesh, both fowl and I'm on the." Oh yeah. Everything creepeth on the earth, so they may breed abundantly in the earth, be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So there's a be fruitful and multiply again. In 8:20, it says, "And Noah builded an altar to the Lord, and took every clean beast and every clean fowl, and burnt offerings on the altar." So this is kind of saying that one of the first things that Noah did after the rain was build an altar to the Lord. So obviously he's still walking with God. And in Genesis 9, we get a lot more of be fruitful and multiply. Actually, one of the important verses I'm just going to pull out now is the first one. And it says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth." And again, and I believe 9:7, yep, "And you will be fruitful and multiply and bring forth abundantly in the earth and multiply therein." So this be fruitful and multiply theme is obviously popping up quite a bit in these early chapters of Genesis. So in verses 2 through 3, it's saying how there's animals for Noah to eat. But verse 4, it very clearly says to Noah, do not eat the blood of the animals. And verses 5 and 6, it starts talking about the life of man. And that verse 7, again, is to be fruitful, multiply. Verses 8 through 17, God is speaking to Noah about the covenant and promising not to flood the earth again. Now, in this promise, the promise token that shows that he's not going to flood the earth again is of a rainbow. And then as you get this from 9:14, which says, "And it shall come to pass when I bring a cloud over the earth that a bow shall be seen in the cloud." So a rainbow. And verses 18 and 19, Noah's sons reproduced. In verse 20, Noah grows a vineyard. And then in verses 21 through 23, Noah gets drunk. Now Noah is found by Ham, and Ham is the son of Canaan. And Ham basically goes out and doesn't cover Noah up right then and there. He goes out and tells two of his brethren, Shem and Japheth. And they come back and they cover Noah up. Now when Noah wakes up, he's pretty upset about what Ham did because he knew that he should have just covered up and not told anybody. So he ends up cursing Canaan, which is Ham's father, but then he turns around and blesses Shem and then enlarge Japheth. By enlarge, it means to kind of uplift Japheth. And then at verse 28 and 29, it states that Noah dies. So I am going to leave part 1 of the book of Genesis here. We are all the way through Genesis 9. So the next time I talk about this, we're going to go to Genesis 10. So as always, I've been Jotman. I'm hoping this new format and what I'm doing here kind of brings more stuff to the channel. So let me know your feedback. Let me know what you think about it. Any suggestions, any criticisms, I would love to hear it. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.